Welcome to Lifestyles of the Not Jet Set, the travel and tourism show that celebrates history, culture, and adventure without harming the environment. People sometimes say traveling is essential for appreciating nature, history, and culture, but is it really? I imagine that I could travel to northern Alaska to see polar bears in the wild, but if my travel requires 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent to get there, what am I really doing for those polar bears? I think to myself I could go to Scandinavia to see the world-class cycling infrastructure, but part of what makes the environmental ethic there tick is their attention to a flying less movement. And so how could I really absorb it if I have to take a jet to get there? I think about traveling to Southeast Asia to see for myself non-Western religions. But the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "Wherever we are, we have the capacity to enjoy the sunshine, the presence of each other, even the sensation of our breathing. We don't need to go to China to enjoy the clear blue sky," he writes. And so you and I find ourselves strangely for this travel and tourism show on the front stoop of my own house. Let's you and I travel through the humble neighborhood of Arlington, Massachusetts to see what history and culture we can find surprisingly close at hand. People say Arlington is a boring inner suburb of Boston. The residents around here have little reason to recall the long history of struggle in these parts. This area was the setting for some of the earliest episodes in America's unjust occupation of indigenous land. In the 1630s, this place belonged to the Wampanoag, who called it Menotomy. A regional leader was known to European settlers as Squaw Sachem of Mystic. Under political and military pressure, she deeded the land around here to the settlers and lived the late part of her life along the shores of the Mystic Lakes, less than a mile behind me over my shoulder. We have arrived at Massachusetts Avenue, which in the 18th century was the main road west of Boston. A nearby historical marker explains that the Black Horse Tavern, which stood here, is where the radical patriots met in what was called the Committee of Safety on April 18, 1775, just a few hours before Paul Revere's midnight ride to call the local militia to arms. The Redcoats marched this direction from Boston, where the commuters now travel at this time of day, and they headed up first to Lexington west of here and then to Concord, where the first real battle of the American Revolution led to their bruising defeat. And before long, late that afternoon, exhausted and still traveling by foot, because at the time there was no tanks or motorized vehicles, they came back this direction under fire from the colonists and faced here in the town of Menotomy the worst fighting of that first day. If Rick Steves did a real travel and tourism show about this busy intersection of Massachusetts Avenue, he would have to point out the belfry on the Methodist church behind me is designed by the architect Charles Bulfinch in the early 19th century. You might say to yourself, how is that possible given that this church was clearly built in the 1920s? But indeed it's true. The belfry was built for the Boylston Market near the Boston Commons in the early 1800s, and decades later was moved to a brewery a few miles away in Charlestown, and then eventually moved here. I'm sure nobody passing by in their cars recognizes this history. In this strange pandemic year, this intersection has also been the site of nightly vigils for Black Lives Matter, recognizing the struggle against police brutality. Just a few yards further, we reach the Minuteman Bikeway, built on the abandoned right-of-way for the early 19th century Lexington and West Cambridge Railroad, which now for a quarter century has been one of the most successful and beloved rail trail paths in the United States. We will return to this bikeway in a future episode. The automated bike rental station is new this year. Finally, we reach Spy Pond, a local gem, especially at sunset. In the late 19th century, a major industry here was shipping ice from this pond in winter. first by rail and then by sailing ship as far away as the Caribbean. Imagine rich landowners in Cuba sipping ice from this very place. The world is so wonderfully dense with history, culture, and nature. We could find it by traveling by jet 10,000 miles, or we can find it right here in our own vicinity, as we did in this episode, traveling merely literally 700 yards, 0.4 miles. You should not think that the lesson is that you should travel to such a wonderful place as Arlington, Massachusetts. Quite the contrary. The lesson is that we can each find the history and art that we seek through our travels, perhaps closer than we might expect. In truth, I do enjoy travel as much as the next person, and so we will not be spending for this show all of our time quite in such a constrained space. But for the next episode, what we need is some vehicle that's green enough to protect the environment and yet modern enough to take us greater distances. What we need is a bicycle.